The Collins home was filled with warmth and the smell of dinner, but for Amara, the air was ice. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, her hands trembling as she finished the chores her foster mother, Karen, had weaponized against her. Robert Collins didn't even look up from his drink as he pointed toward the front door. "You're a burden we're done carrying," he spat. "Fix your attitude in the cold." He shoved her into the heart of a lethal blizzard with nothing but a thin gray coat. Amara walked until her legs wobbled and her breath came in weak, broken clouds, finally collapsing into a snowdrift as her body gave out. Robert watched from the window and turned away, satisfied. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that a black SUV had just idled at the corner. The man stepping out, dark wool coat sharp against the storm and eyes locked on the girl in the snow, was Kim Jun-seo. To the Collins, Amara was a nuisance. To the Korean Mafia boss, she was about to become the reason he started a war. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's continue with the story. The warmth inside the Collins home felt like a cruel taunt, a golden glow that Amara could see but never touch. Standing in the shadows of the foyer, her slim, delicate frame trembled, though not just from the draft snaking in through the floorboards. It was the deep, hollow ache of a stomach that hadn't seen a real meal in 48 hours. To anyone passing by the large bay windows, the house looked like a portrait of suburban perfection. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary wafted from the kitchen, and the rhythmic hum of the central heating served as a steady heartbeat for a family that thrived on the comfort they denied her. Karen Collins stood at the granite island, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her expression one of practiced indifference as she plated dinner. She didn't look at Amara, but she spoke with a voice like sharpened glass. "The floors are still streaked, Amara. I suppose you were too busy daydreaming to actually work." Amara tried to find her voice, but her throat was dry, her lips parched. "I'm sorry, Karen. I felt a bit dizzy. I'll do them again." From the dining table, Jason and Emily exchanged a smirk that held no warmth. Jason, leaning back in his chair with an athletic arrogance, kicked a stray bit of mud onto the tiles she had just finished scrubbing. "Missed a spot," he drawled, his light brown eyes dancing with a malicious disinterest. Emily giggled, adjusting her trendy sweater, her gaze raking over Amara's disheveled natural curls with a look of pure superiority. To them, Amara wasn't a sister or even a guest. She was a glitch in their perfect aesthetic, a shadow that didn't belong in their bright, fashionable world. The bullying wasn't always loud. Most of the time, it was a quiet, systematic starvation of her soul. It was the way they ate in front of her while she was forced to stand by, the way Robert would forget to include her in the grocery budget, and the way Emily would accidentally ruin the few pieces of clothing Amara owned. For the past 2 days, Amara had survived on sips of tap water and the fatting memory of a half-eaten apple she'd found in the trash. Her body felt light, almost ethereal, as if she were slowly vanishing from the world that hated her presence. Robert Collins entered the room, the heavy tread of his boots echoing his stern, unapproachable nature. He looked at the plated food, then at Amara, his dark eyes showing a clinical lack of empathy. He didn't see a girl on the brink of collapse. He saw a failed investment, a burden that had stayed past its welcome. "Karen says you're being difficult again," Robert said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. He didn't wait for an explanation. He never did. He walked to the front door and threw it open, inviting the howling white void of the blizzard into their pristine hallway. The temperature in the foyer plummeted instantly, the wind screaming as it whipped a flurry of snow across the hardwood. "I won't have a parasite under my roof who can't even keep a floor clean," Robert declared, his face a mask of disappointment. He reached into the closet and tossed her gray coat, thin, cheap, and entirely insufficient, at her feet. "Fix your attitude, Amara. Maybe the cold will clear your head. Don't bother coming back until you've learned how to be useful." Amara looked at her foster mother, searching for a single spark of humanity, but Karen simply turned her back to adjust the centerpiece on the table. She looked at Jason and Emily, who were already digging into their feast, the steam rising from their plates in a mockery of her hunger. "Please," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible over the gale. "It's a blizzard. I have nowhere to go." "You have the street," Robert replied, his hand gripping the brass doorknob. "It's more than you deserve." With a final, heartless shove, Robert forced her out. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a finality that vibrated in Amara's very bones, the lock clicking into place like a guillotine. Suddenly, the rosemary and the warmth were gone, replaced by the violent, stinging bite of the north wind. The snow hit her face like a physical blow, blinding her instantly. Amara pulled the thin gray coat around her shoulders, her fingers already beginning to lose sensation as they brushed against the red sweater peeking out from beneath. The world was a white blur, a frozen wasteland that stretched out in every direction. She took a step, then another, her shoes sinking deep into the drifts. Her legs felt like lead, her heart fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. Every breath was a struggle, the air so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. She looked back once at the house, seeing the warm yellow light of the Collins living room through the swirling frost. They were sitting down to eat. They were safe. They had already forgotten she existed. Amara turned toward the darkness of the road, her natural curls quickly becoming heavy with ice. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that the hunger was fatting into a terrifying, seductive numbness. As she trudged further into the white silence, the life-tired exhaustion she had carried for years finally began to win. The streetlights flickered and died, leaving her alone in the belly of the storm, a small, fragile spark about to be extinguished by a world that had never wanted her to burn. The black SUV sat idling like a silent predator at the edge of the woods, its exhaust plume curling into the frigid night air. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the quiet tension of professional violence. Kim Jun-seo's men, hardened soldiers of the underworld, sat in a state of alert readiness, their eyes scanning the darkness for movement. They were used to their boss's calm but intense demeanor, a man who treated every outing like a tactical operation. But as the door had swung open moments ago, and Jun-seo stepped into the blinding white chaos of the blizzard, the air inside the vehicle shifted. Jun-seo moved through the drifts with a sharp focus that ignored the stinging bite of the wind. He didn't hesitate when he reached the small, still form huddled in the snow. To his men watching through the tinted glass, the girl was nothing more than a shadow, a discarded piece of the city's debris. But as Jun-seo knelt, his black-gloved hands reached out with a gentleness that was entirely foreign to the man they knew. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting Amara as if she were made of spun glass. When the heavy door of the SUV hissed open, the interior light spilled out, illuminating the grim scene. Jun-seo stepped inside, the sub-zero air following him like a ghost. He didn't look at his driver or his lead enforcer, Minho, who sat in the passenger seat. His eyes, usually dark and intense with authority, were now clouded with a hint of vulnerability as he looked down at the girl in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, her natural curls frosted with ice, her face a mask of fragile exhaustion. "Drive," Jun-seo commanded. His voice was a low, vibrating baritone that brooked no questions, yet it lacked its usual serrated edge. "And turn the heat to the maximum, now." The driver stammered a quiet, "Yes, boss," and the vehicle lurched forward, tires biting into the slick pavement. A heavy silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the hum of the heater and the sound of Amara's weak, shallow breathing. Minho glanced back, his expression one of suppressed confusion. In their world, a mafia boss didn't stop for strays. They didn't risk exposure for a girl in a thin gray coat who looked like she had walked out of a nightmare. "Boss," Minho began, his voice cautious, "the meeting with the syndicate heads is in 20 minutes. We're already behind schedule. We should drop her at the nearest clinic and—" Jun-seo's gaze snapped up, his jaw tight with a sudden, lethal coldness that silenced the enforcer instantly. "The meeting can wait. If the syndicate heads have a problem with my absence, they can discuss it with me when I return. We are going to the penthouse." Minho's eyes widened slightly before he looked away. The confusion among the team was palpable. This wasn't just a detour, it was a breach of protocol. Jun Seo was a man of power and control, a strategist who never let emotion cloud his judgment. Yet here he was, cradling a stranger, a young black girl whose red sweater peeked out from beneath her coat like a wound, and ordering his team to abandon a high-stakes summit. Jun Seo didn't care about their confusion. He felt the cold radiating from Amara's skin through his tailored wool coat, a chill that seemed to seep into his own bones. He reached up, peeling off one of his black leather gloves to press the back of his hand against her cheek. Her skin was like marble. "She's freezing," he muttered, more to himself than to the men in the front. He shifted her weight, pulling her closer until her cold breath fanned against the pulse point in his neck. For the first time in years, the Mafia boss stereotype cracked. He wasn't thinking about territory or the scorched earth war he was known for. He was thinking about the life-tired look in her eyes before they had closed. He thought about the house he had seen her cast out of, the warm yellow lights of the Collins home, and the stern, unapproachable silhouette of the man who had let her go. The SUV accelerated, weaving through the deserted streets of the city. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside, the temperature was rising. Jun Seo watched as a single snowflake melted on Amara's eyelash, turning into a bead of water that tracked down her temple like a tear. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost to the wind outside. His men exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen Jun Seo execute rivals without blinking. They had seen him dismantle empires with a single phone call. But they had never seen him look at someone with concern and regret. The status swap had already begun. This girl, who had been a nuisance to her foster family only an hour ago, was now the most protected person in Seoul. As the penthouse towers loomed in the distance, Jun Seo tightened his grip on her. He didn't know her name yet, and he didn't know the depth of the betrayal she had suffered. But as the car pulled into the secure underground garage, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world that had tried to freeze Amara out was about to feel the fire of his cold rage. The hunter had found something worth more than power, and he wasn't going to let it go. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, a heavy, expensive quiet that felt worlds away from the screaming wind of the blizzard. When Amara's eyes finally fluttered open, she didn't see the peeling wallpaper of her foster bedroom or the cold, sterile light of the Collins kitchen. Instead, she was met with a ceiling of polished obsidian that reflected the soft, amber glow of a recessed fireplace. The air was warm, thick with the scent of sandalwood and something metallic, like rain on heated stone. She tried to sit up, but her body felt like it was made of lead. She was tucked beneath a duvet of charcoal silk so heavy and soft it felt like a physical embrace. As she shifted, the rustle of the fabric sounded like a thunderclap in the still room. Her hands, no longer numb and blue, were tucked into the sleeves of an oversized black sweater that smelled faintly of a sophisticated masculine cologne. "Don't move too quickly," a voice said, a low, melodic baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "Your core temperature is stable, but your heart rate is still recovering." Amara's breath hitched. She turned her head slowly, her voluminous curls spilling across the silk pillowcase. Sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the window was the man from the snow. In the soft light, Kim Jun Seo looked less like a phantom and more like a king. He had discarded his heavy wool coat, revealing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The sharp, polished aura he carried was still there, but as he stood and walked toward the bed, the stone-cold mask he wore for the world seemed to crack. He didn't tower over her to intimidate. Instead, he sat on the edge of the mattress, his presence commanding yet strangely careful. His dark and intense eyes scanned her face, lingering on the fatting paleness of her cheeks. Amara shrank back instinctively, the life-tired trauma of the Collins household flinching at the approach of a powerful man. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a ragged shadow of itself. "You are safe," Junseo said. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second, giving her the chance to pull away. When she didn't, he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His fingers were warm and his black gloves were gone, revealing hands that were calloused but incredibly steady. "You are in my home, and as long as you are under this roof, no one can touch you." "Robert, he said I was a burden," she murmured, her eyes shimmering with the memory of the door slamming. "He said I wasn't useful." A flicker of cold rage passed through Junseo's eyes, a flash of the Mafia boss who could dismantle empires, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a softness he reserved only for her. He reached for a small porcelain bowl on the nightstand, steam rising from it in delicate plumes. "Robert is a fool who does not understand the value of what he possessed," Junseo said firmly. He dipped a silver spoon into the bowl, a rich, fragrant abalone porridge. He didn't hand her the spoon. He held it up, waiting with a patience that felt like a gift. "Eat. You haven't had a meal in days. I can feel the hollow in you from across the room." Amara hesitated, looking at the silver spoon and then at the man who held it. In her world, food was a weapon, something earned through silence and subservience. But Junseo looked at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. Slowly, she leaned forward and took the bite. The warmth of the food spread through her chest, more intoxicating than the fireplace. "Why?" she asked after a moment, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Why save me? You don't even know me." Junseo set the bowl down and looked at her, his jaw tight with a sudden, raw honesty. "I saw a girl who the world tried to break, and I saw that she refused to shatter. I was hunting for something worthwhile in the cold, Amara. I didn't expect to find a soul that outshone the city lights." He reached out and took her hand, the slim, delicate hand that had been clawing at the snow just hours before. He didn't grip it with the power and control his reputation suggested. Instead, he held it with a hint of vulnerability, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "The Collins family thinks they threw away a shadow," he whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intense focus. "They have no idea they handed me a star. Sleep now. Tomorrow we begin the correction. They will learn exactly what it costs to leave a treasure in the storm." Amara felt the weight of her exhaustion returning, but this time, it wasn't the terrifying numbness of the blizzard. It was the heavy, peaceful sleep of the protected. As her eyes closed, the last thing she felt was the warmth of Junseo's hand on hers, a silent vow that the thin gray coat of her past was gone forever. The status swap wasn't just about the penthouse or the silk. It was the realization that for the first time in her life, she was worth the fire of a dangerous man's devotion. The transition from the world of the Collins family to the reality of Kim Junseo was not a gentle change, but a complete erasure of the past. By the second morning, the obsidian penthouse had been transformed into a hive of quiet, efficient activity. Amara watched from the plush safety of an armchair as a private medical team, handpicked by Junseo, moved with soft footsteps across the heated floors. There were no cold questions or accusatory glares here. Instead, there was the gentle pressure of a blood pressure cuff and the soothing application of specialized salves to her wind-burned cheeks and frost-nipped fingers. Junseo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silent, sharp-focused guardian. He didn't speak while the doctors worked, but his presence was a shield that kept the ghosts of Robert and Karen at bay. Every time Amara winced at a touch, she could see his jaw tight with a flicker of protective rage, though he kept his voice a steady, calming baritone. "The physical damage is superficial," the lead doctor whispered to Junseo, unaware that Amara's hearing had sharpened in the silence. "But the signs of prolonged nutritional neglect are concerning. She has been surviving on the bare minimum for months." Junseo didn't look away from the snow-covered skyline of Seoul. "Ensure she has every supplement, every nutrient she was denied. If she so much as mentions a craving, it is to be fulfilled. When the doctors finally departed, leaving behind a tray of vitamin-rich broths and high-protein delicacies, the second phase of the transformation began. Two women entered the room, pushing a rack of garments that looked less like clothing and more like soft, woven armor. There were no thin gray coats here, no hand-me-downs that Emily had discarded. Jun Seo walked over to the rack, his black leather gloves replaced by bare hands that moved over the fabrics with a connoisseur's touch. He pulled out a coat of heavy, midnight black wool, its lining a deep crimson silk that caught the light of the fireplace. "The Collins family tried to make you invisible," Jun Seo said, turning to look at Amara. His eyes were dark, but the hint of vulnerability was there again, a soft recognition of the woman she was becoming. "They wanted you to blend into the shadows so they could ignore your light. That ends today." He gestured for her to stand. Amara felt a strange flutter in her chest, not the frantic panic of the foster home, but a rising heat of resilience. She stepped into the silk-lined trousers and a sweater of cream cashmere that felt like a warm cloud against her skin. Finally, Jun Seo stepped behind her, lifting the heavy wool coat and draping it over her shoulders. The weight of it was grounding, a physical reminder that she was no longer adrift. As she stood before a triptych of mirrors, Amara gasped. The girl who had collapsed in the snow was gone. In her place was a young woman whose natural, voluminous curls had been meticulously conditioned until they shone like crown jewels. The gray coat of her trauma had been burned away, replaced by the dangerous sophistication of someone who belonged at a king's side. I don't look like an orphan," she whispered, her fingers tracing the sharp, tailored lapel of the coat. "You never were an orphan in spirit, Amara," Jun Seo replied, stepping into the mirror's reflection behind her. He didn't touch her, but the closeness of his muscular build and his powerful presence made her feel untouchable. "You were a queen in exile. I am simply providing the regalia." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate box. Inside sat a pair of simple, black diamond studs. He didn't hand them to her. He waited for her permission. When she nodded, he leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloping her. As he fastened the stones, his fingers brushed against her neck, and Amara realized that the Cinderella moment wasn't about the expensive silk or the obsidian penthouse. It was the way he looked at her, not as a burden to be carried, but as a treasure to be protected. For every meal Robert had denied her, Jun Seo provided a feast. For every cold night Jason and Emily had mocked her, Jun Seo provided a fortress of warmth. The physical traces of the Collins' neglect were being erased, one cashmere thread and one nutrient-rich meal at a time. "They will see you tonight," Jun Seo murmured near her ear, his calm but intense gaze meeting hers in the glass. "When we go back to that house to retrieve the few things you actually care about, they will not see the girl they kicked out. They will see the woman who has the power to destroy them." Amara looked at her reflection, her eyes no longer closed in a faint, but open and burning with a growing strength. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was being reborn. And as Jun Seo adjusted his own dark wool coat, she knew that the blizzard hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the forge. The penthouse office was a sanctuary of glass and cold logic, perched so high above Seoul that the city lights looked like embers in a dying fire. Kim Jun-si sat behind his obsidian desk, the glowing screens before him casting a pale, clinical blue light over his sharp features. He had traded his wool coat for a black silk shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the coiled tension in his neck. His black-gloved hands were folded, but his sharp focus was fixed on a single man standing across from him, Min-ho, who held a thick, leather-bound dossier. "I asked for a background check, Min-ho," Jun Seo said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that made the air in the room feel thin. "I didn't ask for a ghost story." Min-ho cleared his throat, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "It's worse than a ghost story, boss. It's a ledger of greed. Robert Collins didn't take Amara in out of the goodness of his heart. He's a middle-tier accountant for a logistics firm, but his lifestyle, the house, the designer clothes for Emily, the athletic camps for Jason, none of it matches his salary. Our forensic accountants trace the flow. Amara was never his daughter, she was his paycheck. Junseo's dark and intense eyes didn't blink. Explain. Amara was the sole heir to a small life insurance policy and a modest trust left by her biological parents. Minho continued, sliding a bank statement across the desk. The Collins family has been systematically draining it for years. They filed for hardship, expenses every month, money for her food, her clothing, her education. But according to the school records, she missed more days than she attended because she was forced to stay home and perform manual labor. The money meant for her nutrition went into Robert's vintage wine collection and Karen's jewelry. The silence that followed was suffocating. Junseo reached out, picking up a photograph of a younger Amara included in the file. She looked even smaller then, her natural voluminous curls pulled back tightly, her eyes already carrying that life-tired weight. A cold rage began to simmer beneath his skin, not the hot, impulsive anger of a street thug, but the calculated, glacial fury of a man who dealt in the absolute destruction of his enemies. "There's more," Minho added softly. The neighbors reported disturbances several times, crying in the backyard during winter, a girl being forced to wash cars in the rain without shoes. Robert used his position in the community to silence the local social worker. He made it look like Amara was the problem, a difficult child with behavioral issues. It was a character assassination designed to keep her trapped. Junseo stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. He watched the snow fall against the glass, each flake a reminder of the night he had found her. He thought about the thin gray coat that offered no warmth and the red sweater that was the only color in her gray world. He thought about the abalone porridge she had eaten with such hesitant, desperate gratitude. "They didn't just neglect her," Junseo whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "They farmed her. They harvested her trauma to pay for their comfort." He turned back to the room, his calm but intense aura replaced by something far more predatory. The mafia boss stereotype was gone. In its place was a man who had found a purpose for his violence. His jaw was so tight it looked carved from stone, and the hint of vulnerability he showed Amara was nowhere to be found. "Robert Collins likes his comfort," Junseo said, his voice dropping to a lethal, velvet hush. "He likes his reputation. He likes his authority. I want them gone. I don't want him dead, not yet. I want him to watch his world evaporate the way Amara's did in that blizzard, freeze his assets. Every cent they took from her trust is to be returned with 1,000% interest, taken from their own retirement funds." "And the mother, the siblings?" Minho asked. "Karen Collins values her social standing above all else," Junseo replied, his eyes flashing with a dark light. "Release the records of her hardship filings to her elite social circles. Let her friends see the servant they kept in the basement. As for Jason and Emily, their futures are built on stolen blood. Revoke the sponsorships. Cancel the enrollments. If they want to be elite, let them earn it without Amara's inheritance." Junseo walked to his desk and picked up his semi-automatic pistol, checking the chamber with a rhythmic, metallic click. The sound was an exclamation point at the end of a death sentence. The Cinderella transformation Amara was undergoing was only half of the story. The other half was the scorched earth war that was about to arrive at the Collins' doorstep. "They thought no one was watching," Junseo muttered, his gaze drifting to the door of the bedroom where Amara was finally sleeping without nightmares. "They thought she was a shadow that wouldn't talk back. They forgot that shadows are cast by the light, and I am the fire that's going to bring it." The cold rage had reached its boiling point. Kim Junseo wasn't just a savior anymore. He was the reckoning. And as he pulled on his black leather gloves, he knew that by the time he was done, Robert Collins would be begging for the mercy of a blizzard compared to the storm Junseo was bringing to his home. The downfall of the Collins family did not begin with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying precision of a scalpel. In the world of Kim Junseo, Destruction was an art form, and he was a master of the slow bleed. While Amara slept in the safety of the penthouse, cocooned in the warmth she had been denied for years, the digital and social foundations of her foster family's life began to liquefy. The first crack appeared at Robert's firm. He arrived at his office on Tuesday morning, adjusted his business-casual blazer, and prepared to settle into the routine of a man who believed he was untouchable. But the atmosphere was different. The usual nods of greeting from the junior accountants were replaced by hurried whispers and eyes that darted away the moment he looked up. When he reached his desk, he found his computer login disabled. 10 minutes later, he was summoned to the partner's office. There were no pleasantries. On the desk lay a stack of forensic audit results that Jun Seo's team had leaked through an anonymous, untraceable server. The documents didn't just show Robert's embezzlement of Amara's trust. They highlighted years of fudged expenses he had claimed from the firm itself to cover the luxury lifestyle he craved. Robert's stern, unapproachable mask crumbled into a pale, sweating mess as he was told his license was being reviewed for fraud. He was escorted from the building by security, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box, the very picture of the burden he had once called Amara. At the same time, the war reached Karen. She was at her weekly charity luncheon, surrounded by the women whose approval she valued more than her own soul. The conversation was light until every phone at the table chimed simultaneously. A community alert had been sent to the neighborhood association's private forum. It contained no threats, only evidence, receipts for high-end spa treatments and designer dresses, side by side with photos of the empty pantry Amara had been forced to forage from. The silence that followed was more biting than the blizzard Robert had shoved Amara into. Karen's light blue eyes searched for a friendly face, but she found only coldness and disgust. Her proper household image was shattered. The woman who had looked at Amara with superiority and indifference suddenly found herself on the outside of a locked door, the social circle she had spent a decade cultivating closing its ranks against her. But the most surgical strike was reserved for Jason. He sat in his university's athletic center, basking in the athletic, tall arrogance of a star recruit. He was waiting for his final scholarship confirmation, the one that would cement his perfect future. Instead, he was pulled into the athletic director's office. "There's been an issue with the funding, Jason," the director said, looking at a screen that showed a sudden red flag on Jason's financial aid application. The sponsorship that had been paying his way, a charitable grant funded by a shell company Robert had manipulated, had been revoked. Furthermore, an anonymous tip had prompted a review of his academic standing, revealing that several of his perfect essays had been written by a ghostwriter, or more accurately, by Amara, who he had bullied into doing his work late at night while her own grades suffered. By mid-afternoon, the Collins household was in a state of frantic, panicked collapse. The casual, rebellious Jason was shouting about his lost season. Emily was crying over her fashionable clothing accounts being frozen for suspicious activity. Robert sat at the kitchen table, his average build looking smaller and more overweight than ever, his hands shaking as he realized his bank accounts were being drained to repay the 1,000% interest Jun Seo had demanded. Jun Seo watched the live feed of their living room from his office, his black-gloved hand resting on his chin. He didn't feel joy. He felt the cold, industrial satisfaction of a debt being collected. He watched Robert look at the front door, the same door he had shoved Amara through, as if he expected the police to burst in at any second. "They are starting to understand," Jun Seo whispered, his dark and intense eyes fixed on the screen. "They are realizing that everything they have was built on a foundation of ice, and the sun has finally come out." In the other room, Amara was learning how to breathe again. She didn't know the extent of the psychological war Jun Seo was waging on her behalf, but she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The life-tired weight was lifting. For every moment Robert had made her feel like a parasite, Jun Seo was ensuring Robert felt like a ghost. For every time Jason had treated her like a servant, he was learning the reality of being a nobody. The Collins family had thought Amara was a shadow that wouldn't talk back. They didn't realize that Kim Jun-seo was the fire that gave the shadow its shape, and he was growing hotter by the hour. The status swap was no longer a dream. It was a brutal, unavoidable reality. The perfect Collins family was being dismantled, brick by brick, while the girl they had left to die in the snow was preparing to rise from the ashes of their reputation. The stillness of the penthouse was usually a comfort, but tonight it felt like a mirror reflecting every jagged edge of Amara's soul. She stood in the center of the vast, obsidian-floored living room, dressed in the cream cashmere Jun-seo had provided, looking at a small, tattered backpack she had retrieved from the Collins house. It was the only thing she owned that hadn't been bought with stolen trust funds or Jun-seo's mercy. The weight of the silence pressed against her. For years, she had been told she was a glitch, a parasite, and a burden. Now, as she watched Jun-seo command an empire from his desk, the old voices began to scream louder than his kindness. She felt like a guest in a life that was too large for her, a fragile bird in a cage of gold. The life-tired exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was the bone-deep fear that eventually, even a man like Jun-seo would realize she wasn't worth the trouble. She was halfway to the elevator when the heavy tread of his boots stopped her heart. "The wind is still screaming, Amara." Jun-seo's voice came from the shadows, low and calm but intense. "And you are still recovering. Where do you think you're going with a bag that holds nothing but shadows?" Amara didn't turn around. Her shoulders hunched, her natural curls casting a soft shadow against the silk lining of her new coat. "I can't stay here, Jun-seo. You've done enough. You've given me food, a bed, a doctor. You're even destroying the people who hurt me. But I'm just a foster kid from the street. Eventually, you'll look at me and see exactly what Robert saw. A burden." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't cold. Jun-seo moved into her peripheral vision, his powerful presence filling the space. He didn't stop her, and he didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he did something she had never seen him do. He reached for the buttons of his black silk shirt. "You think you are the only one who has been left out in the cold?" he asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He pulled the fabric aside, revealing his shoulder and chest. Amara's breath hitched. Amidst the tall, muscular build of a man who looked invincible were the jagged, silvered remnants of a past she couldn't imagine. A long, puckered scar ran across his collarbone, and another, deeper mark marred the skin near his ribs. They weren't just wounds, they were a map of survival. "This," he said, pointing to the scar near his heart, "is from the night my father's rivals decided a 10-year-old boy was a burden to their progress. I was left in a basement for 3 days with nothing but the dark. I didn't become a mafia boss because I wanted power, Amara. I became this because I was tired of being the one who was thrown away." He stepped closer, his dark and intense eyes softening into that rare hint of vulnerability. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently take the strap of the tattered backpack from her hand. He let it drop to the obsidian floor with a dull thud. "You aren't a burden to me," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "You are the first person I've looked at in 10 years who doesn't want something from me. You are the only part of my day that doesn't feel like a war. You think I'm saving you? Amara, I've spent my life surrounded by people who would kill me for a seat at this table. Finding you in that snow, it didn't give me a project. It gave me a reason to come home." Amara looked at the scars, then up at the man who carried them. The status swap she had been experiencing was external, the clothes, the food, the penthouse, but this was the internal shift. She saw the regret in his eyes, the shared trauma of two people who had been discarded by the world. For the first time, she didn't feel like a servant or a queen in exile. She felt seen. "I don't know how to be this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be someone who stays." "Then we will learn together," Jun-seo replied. He reached out, his bare thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a softness that made her knees weak. "But do not ever think your existence is a weight I'm forced to carry. You are the fire I chose to walk toward. If you walk out that door, you aren't relieving me of a burden. You're leaving me back in the dark." The growing strength Amara had been feeling finally took root. She didn't pick up the bag. Instead, she took a step toward him, closing the distance until her forehead rested against his chest, right over the scar that marked his survival. She felt his heart beating, strong, steady, and for the first time peaceful. The psychological war outside was still raging, and the Collins family was still falling, but inside the obsidian penthouse, the real victory had been won. Amara wasn't a girl in a thin gray coat anymore. She was a woman who was finally learning that her value wasn't something to be earned. It was something to be claimed. And Junseo, the man the world feared, was the only one who had the strength to hold her while she did it. She stayed, and as the blizzard rattled the glass of the penthouse, the warmth between them became the only reality that mattered. The piece of the obsidian penthouse was a fragile glass ornament, beautiful and clear, until the first bullet shattered it. It happened in the dead of night, the hour when the city's light seemed most distant. Amara was asleep, her dreams no longer filled with the Collins' cold hallways, but with the steady beat of Junseo's heart. The sound of the explosion, a muffled, heavy thump from the secure garage below, snatched her from sleep before she could even scream. The room was instantly flooded with a strobing, crimson light. The emergency sirens didn't wail. They hummed a low, vibrating frequency that signaled a code black. Before Amara could reach for the bedside lamp, a shadow moved in the darkness. Junseo was already there, his tall, muscular build silhouetted against the fireplace. He was dressed in black tactical trousers and a shoulder holster, his dark and intense eyes scanning the monitors that lined the wall. "Stay low, Amara," he commanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. "The Park Syndicate found the perimeter. They think I'm soft because I've been distracted by the Collins. They're coming to prove it." He checked the chamber of his semi-automatic pistol with a metallic snick that sounded like a death sentence. But as he turned toward the door, a secondary explosion rocked the building, and the monitors flickered and died. The penthouse plunged into total darkness. "Boss," Minho's voice crackled over the internal comms, strained and distant. "They've jammed the elevators and cut the primary feed. They're coming up the service stairs. We're pinned on the 40th floor." Junseo cursed under his breath, his jaw tight with a rare flash of agitation. He was a master of the scorched earth war, but he was used to being the one holding the match. For the first time, he was defending a heart, not just a territory. He looked back at Amara, his expression a mixture of concern and regret. "I shouldn't have brought this to you," he whispered. Amara stood, the cream cashmere of her sweater a pale ghost in the dark. The life-tired girl who had collapsed in the snow was gone. In her place was someone who had been forged by hunger and silence, someone who knew how to move when the world went cold. She didn't cower. She walked toward the obsidian desk where the backup hardware was housed. "You didn't bring this to me, Junseo." "They did," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And you can't fight them if you can't see them." She remembered Jason's arrogant boasting about his high-end gaming rigs and how he'd forced her to fix his network when he crashed it. She remembered the late nights she'd spent teaching herself the architecture of the very systems the Collins had used to track her. She knelt behind the desk, her fingers flying over a hidden secondary keypad Junseo hadn't even mentioned. "The Collins thought I was a servant because I knew how to fix things they were too lazy to understand," Amara muttered, her growing strength manifesting as a cold, digital precision. "Your security is on a closed-loop bypass. If I can reroute the thermal feed to your HUD, you won't need the monitors." Junseo watched her, his sharp focus shifting from the door to the girl he had rescued. He saw the natural, voluminous curls shadowed by the glow of a tablet she'd pulled from a drawer. She wasn't a burden to be protected. She was a partner in the dark. 30 seconds, Amara said, her breath coming in even, focused rhythm. "I'm bypassing the jammer using the satellite link you keep for your offshore accounts." A soft beep echoed in the room. Junseo's tactical earpiece hissed to life. "I have them," he breathed, his eyes widening as the thermal signatures of the invaders appeared on his visor. Amara, you just gave me the high ground. Go, she said, looking up at him. Her dark eyes reflected the flickering red emergency lights, burning with a fierce, untamed appearance of resilience. I'll stay on the comms. I can trip the fire suppression gas in the stairwell if they get past the landing. Junseo hesitated for a fraction of a second. He leaned down, his softness appearing one last time as he pressed a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead. Lock the door. If anyone but me tries to open it, use the fallback we discussed. As Junseo vanished into the hallway, a shadow of lethal intent, Amara didn't tremble. She sat back behind the desk, the obsidian sanctuary, now her command center. She tracked the heat signatures of the rivals, her voice a calm, steady anchor in Junseo's ear, guiding him through the dark. 2 on the left, Junseo. Behind the reinforced glass, 1 more in the service vent. The sounds of the battle reached her, the muffled thud of suppressed fire, the crash of breaking glass, but Amara remained a stone. She was no longer the girl in the thin gray coat waiting for the world to end. She was the one controlling the light. When the silence finally returned, heavy and thick with the scent of cordite, the door hissed open. Junseo stood there, his black silk shirt torn, his tall, muscular build heaving with exertion. He looked at Amara, who was still sitting behind the desk, her fingers resting on the keys. He didn't say a word. He walked across the room and pulled her into his arms, his black gloves staining the cream cashmere of her sweater. He held her with a powerful presence that was no longer about control, but about gratitude. They're gone, he whispered into her curls, and I would have been blind without you. Amara closed her eyes, leaning into the heat of him. The status swap was complete. She wasn't just a guest in his world anymore. She was the one who kept it from falling into the dark. The Cinderella moment had evolved into something far more dangerous and far more permanent. She was the Mafia boss's anchor, and together, they were a storm the world wasn't prepared to weather. The aftermath of the siege had left the city in a state of crystalline silence, but for the Collins family, the world was screaming. They sat in the center of their pristine living room, though it no longer felt like theirs. The power had been cut, the heat was gone, and the only light came from the sweeping high beams of 3 black SUVs idling in their driveway. Robert Collins sat on the edge of his leather sofa, his average build looking shrunken, his business casual, shirt wrinkled and stained with sweat. Beside him, Karen gripped her blonde hair, her light blue eyes wide with a terror that no social standing could mask. Jason and Emily huddled together, their entitled arrogance replaced by the raw, shivering realization that the world they had built on Amara's stolen inheritance had vanished overnight. The front door, the same oak barrier Robert had slammed shut against Amara, was thrown open. It didn't break. It was simply opened by a man in a dark, tailored wool coat who carried the cold of the underworld with him. Kim Junseo stepped into the room, his dark and intense, eyes raking over the family with a clinical, lethal detachment. He didn't say a word. He simply stood aside, making a path. Then she stepped in. Amara moved with a powerful presence that silenced the room. She was draped in the midnight black wool coat Junseo had given her, the deep crimson silk lining peeking out like a promise of fire. Her natural, voluminous curls were perfectly styled, framing a face that no longer showed exhaustion or helplessness. She looked at the foyer where she had once shivered, and then she looked at Robert. Amara, Robert's voice was a pathetic wheeze. He slid off the sofa, his knees hitting the hardwood. Amara, please, there's been a mistake. We were just trying to teach you discipline. We're your family. You aren't my family, Amara said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the freezing room. You were my jailers. You fed on my future while I starved in your shadows. Karen reached out, her hands shaking. Amara, think of the children, Jason's scholarship, Emily's reputation. We'll give the money back, all of it. Junseo took a step forward, his hand resting on the semi-automatic pistol at his hip, his jaw tight with the cold rage that had fueled the last week. "The money is already gone," he said, his baritone vibrating through the house. "Every cent is back in Amara's accounts. Your house is in foreclosure. Your cars are being towed. You have exactly what you gave her, nothing." Robert began to sob, a hollow, ugly sound. He crawled toward Amara's boots, expensive, polished leather that had never touched the mud of his backyard. "Have mercy," he begged. "Don't let them take everything. Where will we go?" Amara looked down at the man who had shoved her into a blizzard. She felt the weight of the Cinderella moment, but it wasn't a fairy tale anymore. It was justice. She looked at Junseo, who was waiting for her word. One nod from her, and Junseo's men would ensure the Collins family disappeared into the same white silence they had tried to consign her to. The growing strength in her chest flared. She thought of the thin gray coat and the red sweater. She thought of the abalone porridge and the way Junseo had bandaged her hands. "I won't kill you," Amara said, her dark eyes locking onto Robert's. "That would be an end, and I want you to have a beginning. I want you to walk out that door, Robert. I want you to feel the wind. I want you to walk until your legs wobble and your breath comes in broken clouds. I want you to find out if the world is as kind to you as you were to me." She turned to Junseo. "Let them go, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, just like I had." Junseo's expression softened into that rare hint of vulnerability. He saw the transformation was complete. She wasn't seeking blood. She was seeking a clean break from the rot of her past. He signaled to Minho, and his men stepped back, opening a path to the door. The Collins family scrambled out into the night, fleeing into the cold darkness of the street they had once used as a weapon. They left behind the warmth and the light, becoming the very shadows they had tried to make Amara. As the door remained open, letting the winter air swirl into the house one last time, Junseo walked over to Amara. He didn't speak of the war or the victory. He reached out and laced his fingers through hers, his black gloves meeting her warm skin. "It's over," he whispered. "The debt is paid." Amara looked at the empty house, then back at the man who had found her in the drifts. The life-tired girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew she was worth the fire. "Where to now?" she asked. Junseo smiled, a real, soft smile that changed the entire aura of the Mafia boss. "Wherever you want. The city is wide, Amara, and this time you aren't walking through it alone." They walked out together, leaving the haunted house behind. The black SUV was waiting, but as Amara stepped into the warmth of the vehicle, she didn't feel like a passenger. She felt like a partner. The snow had stopped, and the stars were finally visible through the clearing clouds. Behind them, the ice was melting. Ahead of them, a new kingdom was waiting to be built, one founded not on fear or stolen trust, but on the impossible survival of a girl who had found her heat in the heart of a dangerous man. The car pulled away, disappearing into the bright, waiting lights of Seoul, leaving only a set of tracks in the fresh snow that would soon be forgotten. But Amara would never forget. She had survived the cold, and now it was time to burn. Amara was left in the cold by the people who should have loved her, but she found a fire that would never go out. If you believe everyone deserves a place to call home, and that some debts must be paid in full, hit that like button and subscribe. Don't let her story end here. Join our community for more tales of survival and the dangerous men who protect those the world forgot. Thanks for watching, and remember, the coldest nights often lead to the brightest mornings.